Okay, back again. The second video of the day, and you'll excuse me, please, if I wear my readers, because I will be reading some stuff to you, and I need to be able to see what I'm reading. Anywho, all right, so my earlier video was about the lies the media tells, especially as relates to COVID and the vaccines, etc. Hopefully you've seen that. Excuse me. And this one is going to be about the recent occurrence in Richmond, Virginia, where the Robert E. Lee Monument finally was taken down. Certainly a sad day in the history of our state, in the history of the country. A sad day because it shows the willingness of most Americans to simply ignore, erase, or just disregard history. Now, I understand that there are people who don't like the Lee Monument or any Confederate monuments. Okay, I get it. I see stuff I don't like. There are statues out there to people I don't think we should have statues to. I'd like to see them taken down. But you know what I don't do? Unlike the left in this country, what I don't do is demand that they be removed. I don't go out and vandalize them. I don't throw ropes around them and try to pull them down. I don't demand that the government get involved and seek to remove them. If I see something I don't like, I just ignore it. But I recognize, I understand that there are people who do want to see that statue or that monument, and they have every right to. Just as I have a right to the ones that I'd like to see remain. Is that concept so foreign to most of you Americans? Do you really not understand how that works? It's called respect. I respect your rights and your exercise of those rights as long as you don't infringe on others. I expect you to show me that same respect. Is that unreasonable? Am I wrong? Should I start to behave the way you behave? Now, this video is going to probably be a little longer than most. So, you know, if you have to set aside some special time later to watch the whole thing, I understand. I just don't think there's any quick way I can make some of these points. No way to abbreviate them, if you will. So I'm simply going to treat this as I would in one of my classes, a history lesson. I'm going to try to make it as succinct as I can, but I also want to make it understandable, relatable. And I would challenge you, as I often challenge my students, if you don't want to believe me, that's fine. Look it up. Do some research. Don't believe the talking heads on TV. They lie. They've proven it time and again. Don't believe politicians. Politicians are full of crap, and they lie. And don't believe the mainstream media. They're simply shills for the aforementioned. And activists, political activists, they have an agenda, and that agenda does not always include the truth. Do your own research. The information's out there. And yes, it can take time. I understand. You have to have the time to do it. But if you want to get the real story, trust me, I recognize there are two sides to every story. There's especially as regards the Civil War, which we'll be addressing. There's the Union side and there's the Confederate side. And I realize that both sides have their glorified version. And somewhere in the middle, after you read enough, after you do enough research, you'll find that there's a truth in there somewhere, that both sides have valid points and both sides might not have valid points. So do it. Do your research. If you care, if you really want to get to the truth. If you're one of those people, sadly, who is satisfied to just believe whatever your TV tells you, there's nothing I can do to help you. I mean, I've learned a long time ago, and I learned it the hard way, that there's just people in this country who don't want to learn. And if they don't want to, you can't make them. So now, one of the issues, one of the words that gets used a lot when it comes to Confederate monuments, to Robert E. Lee, to Thomas Jackson, to any of the Confederates, is treason. They were traitors. Why would you want to have statues to traitors? Well, what is a traitor? Have we actually thought about that word and what it means? Let's start with this. Treason. Treason is the crime of attacking a state authority to which one owes allegiance. This typically includes acts such as participating in a war against one's native country, attempting to overthrow its government, spying on its military, its diplomats, or its secret services for a hostile and foreign power, or attempting to kill its head of state. Well, let's break that down, all right? And before I break that down, let me just give you one more definition. This is from Merriam-Webster, definition of treason: the offense of attempting by overt acts to overthrow the government of the state to which the offender owes allegiance, or to kill or personally injure the sovereign or the sovereign's state. Okay. Treason. Robert E. Lee was a traitor. Thomas Jackson was a traitor. Most Confederate soldiers were traitors, right? That's what the left tells you. If you're here in Richmond and you're on Facebook and you see TV6, TV8, TV12, Richmond Times-Dispatch Facebook pages, most of the comments from the leftists, from the anti-monument crowd, will say, whoa, traitors, treason. Okay. Attacking a state authority to which one owes allegiance. Well, define state. Do you mean state as in Virginia or North Carolina, or state as in federal government? What did most Americans of the mid-19th century consider to be their state or their country? If you asked the average Virginian, the average North Carolinian, the average New Yorker, what is your country? Most of them are going to tell you Virginia, North Carolina, New York. I see Virginia as my country. This is my state. This is where I owe my allegiance. And why would they say that? I mean, we have, at this point, the United States of America is about 80-some years old. So it exists. Why would most people still think of their state as their country, as their home? Because, and we'll get into this later, because the Union, the United States, was considered a voluntary union. Look up the word voluntary. This was part of the ratification process, and the Constitution was not looked favorably upon by the anti-federalists. And one of the things that they had to be assured of before they would ratify that Constitution was that it was to be a voluntary union, which they could leave if they felt that union was being abusive of their rights. Okay. Now, again, don't believe me. Look it up. Do some research. The information is out there. You simply have to want to find it. Okay? So let's just stick with Robert E. Lee as the prime example of this. Authority to which one owes allegiance, a state authority to which one owes allegiance. Well, Robert E. Lee was offered command of the Union armies, which Lincoln wanted to use to invade the southern states, to bring them back into the Union, to stop the rebellion. And Lee, being a native Virginian, said, no, I will not take part in invading my home state. I will not attack my home state. Now, I know that words like honor and duty are anachronistic words to most Americans. They have no meaning. Most Americans haven't been taught what either of those words mean. They have no concept, no idea. Those of us who have read a modicum of history do seem to have an understanding of what those words mean. And to Lee, honor and duty dictated that he remain with his home state, Virginia. He wasn't anxious to secede. In fact, if you've read anything about Lee, you know that he was against secession. He discouraged it. He hoped that his state would not do it, but they did. And that forced him to make a decision. And he made it. I'm going to stay with my home state. This typically includes such acts as participating in a war against one's native country. Well, Lee didn't want to do that. He didn't want to participate in a war against his home state, Virginia. And in fact, he and most Southerners did not want to participate in a war against the Union at all. They simply wanted to be left alone to create their own country. Now I can hear you. Now I can see the knees jerking on the left. Create their own country, but they were already part of the United States. Yeah, they were. And like I said a few minutes ago, voluntary union. Look up the ratification process. Do some research on that and understand what was meant by our founding fathers when they talked about a voluntary union. The South didn't want a war. The South wasn't looking for a war. They simply wanted to start their own country and to be left alone. Why is that so hard to understand? Attempting to overthrow its government. Well, were the southern states that formed the Confederacy trying to overthrow the Union? If they were, why didn't they immediately launch an attack against Washington, D.C. to overthrow that Union government? In fact, they warned that Union government. They told Lincoln, do not try to supply Fort Sumter. Do not send your troops down here. If you do so, we will see it as an act of aggression. They told him that clear and straight up. Don't do it. If you do, it will be seen as an act of aggression. Imagine if the Southern armies or a Southern army or a Southern militia on the border with Washington, D.C. decided, you know what, we're just going to march into Washington, D.C. and take over the place. Would that have been seen by the North as an act of aggression? You know damn well it would, and rightly so. So why was the resupplying of Fort Sumter by the Union, after being warned not to because it was in Southern territory, it was part of the Confederate States of America, why was that not seen as an act of aggression by the North? Well, you know the reason. Attempting to overthrow its government, spying on its military, its diplomats, its secret services for a hostile and foreign power, or attempting to kill its head of state. Well, was there any attempt in 1861 or 1860 or 61 to kill Abraham Lincoln? That wouldn't come until later, and that wasn't fomented by the government. That was just a group of people who decided this is what we have to do. So again, when we're looking at the word treason, when we're going to call people traitors, you need to break that down. That word means something. Calling someone a traitor means something. Based on the definition of the word treason, was Robert E. Lee a traitor? I don't think so. And I'll tell you why the Union government didn't think so. Are you ready for this? I know this is going to blow your mind. Do you know that not one single Confederate soldier, leader, generals, colonels, whatever, or political leader was ever tried for treason? Some of them were arrested initially and released. Jefferson Davis was arrested and held in Fort Monroe for a while, and he was eventually released. Do you know why? The only Confederate that was ever tried for any crime was Captain Henry Worth of Andersonville Prison, because he, quote unquote, allowed Union soldiers to starve to death down there. Of course, they don't want to talk about Camp Chase, Camp Douglas, or Elmira, or any of the northern prisoner of war camps where they purposely starved Confederate prisoners. What they don't want to tell you about is that in Andersonville, as in most of the South, there wasn't enough food for anybody. The Confederate soldiers, Confederate civilians, and especially Union prisoners of war. Why? Because Sherman and others were burning the South. They were destroying crops. They were destroying the South's ability to produce food. So no one had food. They were blockading its ports so food could not be imported from elsewhere. Part of the Union strategy was to starve the South. Well, duh. If you're starving the entire South, you think the Union prisoners aren't going to be part of that? But they had to have a scapegoat. They had to charge somebody, so they charged Worth. But Davis, Lee, and none of the Wade Hampton, John B. Gordon, I mean, pick one. Pick a Confederate leader. None of them were ever tried for treason. Do you know why? Because Union lawyers at the time, attorneys for the Union, determined that if they took this to trial, they were going to have to talk about certain things, certain founding documents, certain founding principles that would indicate that, in fact, secession was legal, and that, in fact, secession being legal, it was the Union who precipitated the war through its aggressive acts. They didn't want that in the news. They didn't want people thinking about that. So they just kind of pushed it off to the side and forgot about it. Now, again, all you people out there sitting there reading this or hearing this and your knees are jerking and you're going, oh, this guy's crazy. He's full of crap. The research is out there. I've been reading about this subject since I was a kid. I know what I'm talking about. You can argue with me if you want to. You can tell me I'm crazy all you want. Not only have I done the research, I know a lot of other people I consider smarter than me who've done research on this subject. And they agree. So at some point, you're going to have to look in the mirror and ask yourself, do I really know what I'm talking about? Or am I simply parroting what I heard some guy on TV say or some political activist say? These are the things you have to look at. Now, we've talked about the fact that it, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many others, it was not treason. What are we basing that on? You do realize that the United States of America, the 13 British colonies that would become the United States of America, was created through an act of treason. So, Mr. and Mrs. Leftists, Mr. and Mrs. Anti-Monument, Mr. and Mrs. Anti-Secession, should the United States of America be allowed to exist, or should we still be subjects of the British Crown? Which is it? We seceded from the British Crown. We created this country through an act of secession, through an act of quote-unquote treason. Now, you may say, well, it wasn't treason. Oh, well, we were Americans. Well, let's ask King George and his people if it was treason. You think King George and the British Parliament didn't see it as treason? Do you think the guys who signed the Declaration of Independence weren't put on a list by King George to be hanged upon sight because they were, quote unquote, traitors? The Declaration of Independence set the tone. And I'm going to read part of it to you because I'm sure many of you who think you know the history of this country have not read it and don't understand it. So let's read it, shall we? This is not the entirety of the Declaration. This is the second paragraph. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, the pursuit of happiness was originally life, liberty, and property. That got changed to pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Consent of the governed. Do you understand what that means? If you don't, type in the comments section that you're not sure what that means, and I'll try to explain it in more detail. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, I'm going to read that again. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, destructive of what ends? Destructive of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Any form of government, if it becomes destructive of any of those three things, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. Alter or to abolish. Alter means to change. You can make changes for the better. Sometimes they turn out not to be for the better, but that's the plan. Or abolish it. What does abolish mean? Do you know what the word abolish means? Look it up. And to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Is any part of that confusing to you? And I'm not trying to be snarky here. I'm dead serious. Is there any part of what I just read so far that you find confusing or that you don't understand? Because if it is, if any of it's confusing, I'll try to explain it better and in more detail. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. So basically what it's saying here is there are going to come times in the life of a group of people, a nation, a state, whatever, where the people will have suffered abuses from the government. And up to a certain point, they're willing to tolerate those abuses. But there comes a time when they've had enough and they say, that's it. We're not putting up with this anymore. So every time the government does something that may tick you off a little bit, to just jump up and go, we're seceding. We're getting out of here. We're leaving. It's probably not the most prudent way to deal with a situation. But when you have a long train of abuses, as is stated in the Declaration, when it continues day after day, year after year, and you've made redress, you've tried to get your government or officials to listen to you, to stop what they're doing, to understand that they are abusing your rights, and they simply say, hey, go pound sand. We're in charge. We're doing what the hell we want. Then the people have a right to stand up and say, no, I don't think you're going to be able to do that anymore. We're going to do something about it. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. To alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let the facts be submitted to a candid world. Is there anything about what I just read that you don't understand? And so, the southern states, now we can have a different argument on this later, decided that with the election of Abraham Lincoln and what they saw as the radical Republican Party, which wanted to end slavery, they decided, we're going to leave. We're going. Now, the question you have to ask yourself is, did everyone in the South own slaves? Did everyone in the South agree that they should secede? And I'll go back to Robert E. Lee as an example. Lee did not want secession. He was a Union man. Many people in the South did not want secession. West Virginia became a state because that section of Virginia was heavily pro-Union and did not want to secede from the United States. They wound up seceding from Virginia, but they didn't want to secede from the United States. So see, this subject, this topic is much deeper than you would have us believe it is. The vast majority of Southerners did not own slaves. The vast majority of Southern fighting men in the armies did not own slaves and were not fighting to keep slaves. They were fighting primarily in their eyes because they were being invaded. Bottom line. A foreign army, in their eyes, was invading their home state, and they needed to defend their home state. Yes, there were people fighting for slavery. If I'm a rich plantation owner with 12,000 acres of land and 800 slaves, and I'm making big money selling my tobacco and cotton and indigo and rice across the country or overseas, yeah, I'm probably going to be for slavery, and I'm going to want to see it maintained. But that was not the majority of Southerners. Just as today you see politicians and people with money making decisions for you that you don't agree with. Have you ever stopped to think about that? Compare today, the media, the government, with back then, the media, the government. Do you think the media was telling them the absolute unvarnished truth about everything? Either North or South. Do you think there weren't moneyed interests that wanted to see the separation for a variety of reasons, mostly economic? Do you think there weren't people in the South who wanted to see slavery abolished? There's more to this than just South gray, North blue, South bad, North good. I'm reading a book right now called Slavery in the North. And it goes into great detail about how the North not only had slaves, but benefited from the slave trade. You don't want to hear about that, do you? No, we're not going to talk about that. But the Declaration of Independence says right there, you have the right to secede, to cast off that government which is abusive of your rights and your freedoms. And when it comes to the South, the separation you have to make, the question you have to address is, did everyone in the South want slavery? Did everyone in the South benefit from slavery? Or human nature being what it is, were they upset primarily because what they saw as an invading army was coming into their state? The only way you're going to know the answers to these questions, and again, you don't have to believe me. I know you don't want to believe me. I'm not a talking head on TV. But read the books that were written by the people who lived through it, not the generals or the politicians. With politicians, you're going to get the political viewpoint. With generals, you're going to get the battle strategies and the campaigns. But the soldiers, the guys lugging a musket, carrying a 40-pound backpack and a blanket and an overcoat, marching in the summer heat in Virginia 20 miles a day, getting shot at, dying from diarrhea and dysentery, losing limbs. Why were they doing it? Was it because they were traitors? Is that really what you think? So we've discussed what treason is, which would make someone a traitor. We've discussed the Declaration of Independence and why the Declaration, as one of our founding documents, says that you have the right to break away from an abusive government. Now, we can argue about what is and is not abusive, I suppose. That would be another discussion for another time. But we're talking about how things were viewed at that time by those people. And to take today's contemporary mores and your contemporary ideas about what is right and is wrong and take it back 170, 180 years and ask, well, why did they think that way? Why did they do that? Why didn't they stand up against it? A lot of them did. 150 years from now, somebody's going to look back on our history and go, they aborted 1 million babies a year? That's gruesome. That's horrible. Why would they do that? You, on the other hand, think it's perfectly normal. It's just the way it is. This is the system I was born into. This is the way it's always been. So women aborting their babies, that's no big deal. Why is anybody upset about that? But do you think 150 years from now, people looking back on our history are going to go, what the hell were they thinking? Part of the process of ratifying the Constitution was determining whether it was going to be a better system than the Articles of Confederation. There were many people, many of our founding fathers, who said, nah, they were called anti-federalists, who said, nah, this idea of a strong central government is not so good. We just fought a 7-year war against a strong central government in the form of King George III, and we're not anxious to create our own strong central government. The Articles of Confederation might need some tweaking here and there. We agree with that. But as far as changing it altogether, nah, maybe not such a good idea. Anti-Federalists, and this is from, let me scroll up here, American Freedom Institute. And this is from April 26th of 2019. Anti-Federalists were concerned that the checks that the Constitution placed on federal power would be ignored and undermined by generous interpretations of certain provisions in the Constitution. Quote, promote the general welfare, unquote, and, quote, necessary and proper, unquote, were two clauses and phrases that worried anti-federalists. The general welfare clause could be used to support just about any new law, while the necessary and proper clause could override any limit set on federal power. This would create a centralized government that had unlimited powers that most certainly would be abused. Well, let me ask you, Mr. and Mrs. American, were the anti-federalists right? Has not what they prophesied come to pass? Look at your federal government now. Read the Constitution sometime. and look at the enumerated powers afforded the federal government. Enumerated, spelled out, numbered. They had specific and very limited powers. The rest were left to the states or the people respectively. Do you think the federal government has long ago usurped its authority and is now doing things it was never intended to do? I humbly submit that the anti-federalists were absolutely right. And we're suffering for it now because many people didn't have the foresight to see what was coming. Look at the abuses of your federal government today, the abuses that it has been exercising for many decades now. And ask yourself, who was right, the Federalists or the Anti-Federalists? There are many other examples of why Robert E. Lee and the others in the South were not traitors, were not treasonous. They were not trying to overthrow the Union government. They were not attacking the Union. They were simply trying to leave. They were trying to exercise those concepts spelled out in the Declaration of Independence that said you have a right to cast off abusive government. The nature of the Constitution. Why would the Constitution indicate that it's okay to leave the Union? Well, number one, go back to the ratification process. What had to be done, what had to be guaranteed to the anti-federalists before they would acquiesce, before they would say, okay, all right, we'll give this Constitution thing a try. We're not crazy about it. We still think there's some problems here, but we'll give it a try if you do two things. One, Bill of Rights. We want individual liberties and rights spelled out. Now, you can't possibly spell out every single one. There are too many. But they picked 10 of the top ones. And the 10th one being states' rights, which said that the federal government has certain limited authority. Everything else goes to the states. Nature of the Constitution. A compact is an agreement between two or more entities. Write this word down if you don't understand. Compact, C-O-M-P-A-C-T, is an agreement between two or more entities which is voluntarily maintained. A contract, C-O-N-T-R-A-C-T, is an agreement between two or more entities which is legally binding. There are no repercussions, aside perhaps social criticism, to breaking a compact. There are repercussions to violating a contract. The Constitution is a compact rather than a contract. Why? Contracts are legally binding. There must therefore be a legal framework in place which is external to the contract. Otherwise, there is nothing to enforce it. This is not the case with the constitutions, as the Constitution defines the validity of law within the, quote, many states, unquote. The Constitution, therefore, must be a compact and as such as voluntarily maintained. Voluntarily maintained. Many of the founding fathers, many of the anti-federalists said, as long as this is a voluntary union and we can leave whenever we deem it necessary, okay, we're in. But we're going to be watching, and if we don't like what we see, we will leave. And this concept was accepted, and thus the Constitution was ratified. Again, don't believe me if you don't want to. Do your research. I'm not just making this stuff up out of whole cloth. I didn't just wake up one day and go, hey, This would be cool. I'll tell people this. And there's no way they can prove or disprove it. They'll just have to accept my word for it. No, I've done the research. I've read about these things. And I've seen both sides of the issue. And again, I will ask you, were the anti-federalists wrong? Look around you. Look at your federal government today and ask that question. So to those of you who want to continue with this craziness that Robert E. Lee was a traitor, the monuments on Monument Avenue were a bunch of traitors, and they were committing treason against the United States, and they were trying to overthrow the United States government. I respectfully, I'm trying so hard to be nice about this. I respectfully submit you're wrong. You're simply repeating what you're hearing others say. You haven't bothered at all to take the time to do your own reading or research and to understand, or even try to understand, those who came before us, what their mindset must have been. You're throwing human nature completely out the window. You're accepting this idea that some poor dirt farmer in Alabama who's just eking out a living for himself and his family is going to go fight in a war and risk getting blown to pieces so some rich plantation owner 12 miles down the road with 600 slaves can keep his slaves? Do you know anything at all about human nature? Does that sound like something that someone you know would do? Because I got to tell you, if I'm going to risk getting my head shot off or one of my limbs torn off or killed in battle or dying from dysentery out in the field, it's going to be for something besides some plantation owner keeping his slaves. And maybe that's something you need to think about that you obviously haven't considered before now. Was Robert E. Lee a perfect human being? No, none of us know anybody who's perfect. None of us are perfect. We all have faults. But I'll tell you what, excuse me, if there were someone that I would want my son, my daughter to emulate, it would be Robert E. Lee. And I'm not the least bit ashamed to say it. I wish I could live up to the standards of that man. But I tend to come up short in that category. So I hope that helps. I hope it gives you some impetus to go out and maybe do some more reading or research, to actually think for yourself instead of just parroting what you hear somebody on TV say. That's about the best I can do right now, without taking another hour to do this. If you have any questions, if you have any doubts about anything I just said, there's a question, there's a comment section. You can ask me whatever you want. I can't guarantee you're going to like my answers, but I'll do the best I can to give you an accurate one. I hope that's been helpful. Bye now.